Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries. I'm John and this is Hannah.
Hi.
And all this month we're going to be looking at the various prompts for RPGaDay 2025. So let's get into it.
So it's day 14 and we're looking at mysteries.
Yep.
And well, we talked about a game you quite liked the looks of last time. So how about we talk about that Brindlewood Bay?
Yep. Brindlewood Bay is a neat little small book, which gets it a big tick in my book. No pun intended. Hashtag small book club. It's described as a dark and cozy mystery game by Jason Cordova, who listeners may recognise as having written a number of books. And Brindlewood Bay is a sort of powered by the apocalypse style game, based very much around that sort of murder she wrote, cozy sort of mystery club style vibe, albeit with a cheeky little bit of Cthulhu mythos flown in there.
Yeah, it's kind of like Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, only you're playing old ladies instead of high school teenagers.
Yeah, pretty much. I suppose if you imagine that there's like a group of like Miss Marples or Jessica Fletchers, if you like a bit of Murder, She Wrote, all gathered together in their cosy living room in Cabot Cove, murder capital of the world. And they've all sort of gathered round, and in that sort of Miss Marple way, they just so happen to have noticed that like something strange or unusual is going on. So they get to talking about it with their friends, the Mavens, as they're called in this book. They're sort of their club, and that leads to them discussing it, getting involved in the mystery, and gradually sort of in the campaign mode of the book, tumbling onto a much sort of darker, mythos-esque conspiracy that lurks behind the placid, blood-soaked front of the fictional town where it's set.
I'm just looking at the artwork in the book, and some of it's really quite nice.
Yeah, it's all got that sort of... I know it's not watercolour, but it's got that sort of cosy, like, watercolour-esque sort of, like, feel to it. But if you look in each picture, there's always, like, one element or another that looks a little bit out of place. Like, we're looking at one at the moment on page 13, where it's got a cosy picture of an old granny sat there knitting in a chair. She's got one of those chintzy plates on the wall and a little picture of a flower. But there's a cat on the back of her chair. Its fur is, and its sort of hackles are raised. Its tail's puffed up like a bog brush, and it's staring directly at the viewer or the camera, depending on however you want to call it.
And if you look very closely on the back of the chair, there's an almost human shadow cast.
Yeah, like someone's about to loom across
and
the
like
woman.
The cat's looking at whoever's casting the shadow.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that does a really good job of sort of explaining the sort of feel of the game, because it's supposed to be this very cozy sort of mystery club sort of vibe, but as you get more into it, the sort of unsettling elements become more and more prevalent, until almost just sort of ripping the mask off this otherwise sort of placid, like, little community that seems so sort of white picket fence on the surface.
I noticed that the ability scores are all sort of social and mental, with just the one physical score called vitality.
Well, yeah, and I think there's an obvious reason why that is. If you're all effectively playing like octogenarian sort of mystery club grannies, then let's face it, you're not going to be like throwing down with like the evil cult leader and his like burly minions, are you? Because you're not going to be getting very far unless you're like aiming to like get a broken hip or something like that. But the idea of the game is very much based less around, we found the villains, we're going to go and thump them until they cry uncle and they surrender. The idea is that I suppose you're in the sort of style of like, the consulting detective sort of idea, or the sort of the busybody amateur, but who's got some sort of skills. You've all seen this in procedural detective shows where there's the criminal consultant who's not actually a sort of professional, but they've got certain unique perspectives that they often annoy the official police officers with, but they tend to get results, so they work with them. The idea in this is very much that like your little group of like mystery grannies get together, they work out who's behind it and what's going on. They then take that information to the police, who do the actual arresting, rather than like old Granny Denise or whatever her name is, like rolling up her sleeves and like picking up a stick and going in and like giving them 6 of the octogenarian's best.
So what about like setting up mysteries in a game in general?
Yeah, I mean, I often take from, not so much this particular Power by the Apocalypse game, but from another one that I play that's similar to this, which is Tremulous, which is basically a Power by the Apocalypse, Call of Cthulhu sort of vibe of game. And that's all based around mysteries and seems to have very similar mechanics to this from what I can see. And that's based, the mystery is based around clues. Mm-hmm. The GM sets up a number of clues. They lead either onto scenes where you encounter things, or they lead on to other clues which they themselves lead on to things. And that's pretty much how I set up my mysteries. I'll have a loose selection of scenes, you know, from the start, when you first come across some inciting incident or evidence of the mystery. The most obvious being, you know, a dead body's found. There's the mystery. Who are they? How did they die? Who did it, effectively? But it could be other things like, I don't know, maybe a prize idol is stolen from a museum. There's the mystery, who stole it. But one thing I try and do is I try and make the original inciting incident like very obvious, because if that doesn't take, you don't have a game, really.
So would you say it's better to start off with who done it and what they done, and then let the players go and prod around at it and have in your head a couple of mistakes that the bad guys made? Or would you say it's better to have, I know what's been done, and then I'm going to listen to the players mull over it and make up an ending on the fly in the game?
Well, I think, to be honest, either of those options can work. I think the danger of I'm going to listen to the players and make it up, which can work, don't get me wrong. I think the danger there, though, is I don't mean this in any bad way, but if you're not sufficiently sort of subtle with it, and it becomes very obvious to the players that you're just sort of winging it, then, as we were saying in a previous episode where we were talking about player choice, if you know the GM's just reacting to what you're saying and they're making it up as they go along, then you can make whatever choices you want. It doesn't really matter. Now, if you are making it up as you go along and you're listening to the players, or, as I'll often do, I'll have an idea in mind for what's going to happen, but if the player characters come up with a link I'd not considered, or they come up with something better that they seem like dead certain on, and I think, oh, that's actually better than what I've got planned, I might go with that. But having that other framework allows me to do that with more subtlety, so the players don't immediately think, oh, well, he's just making this all up on the fly. Because I think the players get a lot more satisfaction if they think, oh, the GM's created this whole mystery and I've unravelled it. I've worked out all the clues. I know who it is. And yes, sometimes you can tweak it. Like, I don't know, let's say we'll go with our idol stolen from the museum sort of vibe that we were talking about earlier. And let's say I'm using a silly example, but let's say one of the player characters goes, oh, I'll dust it for fingerprints, and I've not considered anything about there's fingerprints on it or whatever. I'm not going to say, well, no, you don't find any fingerprints, because that's boring. But I also don't want to say, yeah, you find fingerprints, you test everyone in the neighbourhood, you've arrested the culprit, well done, game session is over. But what I might do in my head is I might go, okay, well, instead of the NPC I'd planned to originally be doing the theft, doing it directly himself, maybe he hired some goons to do the theft. That's why the mistake got made, because the goons weren't as good as his. Or maybe he realises that they've made a mistake, and he's now trying to take out these goons. So maybe when you track down the goon, you arrive at the house. Oh, they've been murdered. There's a body. The body is now another clue.
So another important part of this is sort of having a rough idea of how you players are likely to go about investigating your mystery.
Yeah, very much so.
And how certain players will deal with certain clues. So, for example, your guy who's done the theft and left his fingerprints behind and been hired to do that.
Yep.
Some players are going to go down and beat the crap out of him to get all the information.
Yeah.
Some players are going to look into his background and what contacts he's got and who he's been on the phone to recently.
Yeah.
Some players are gonna ask around other local contacts, have they seen him with anyone? So it's always sort of a good idea to have, like, how are your players going to do this in your head when you start putting one of these sort of stories together.
Yeah, I entirely agree, and that's one of the benefits of having a bit of a framework. So to continue our example, if I've then worked out that, like, oh, the mastermind, let's call him, he's hired a guy to go and steal this, like, ancient idol from the museum or whatever, I'll then think, well, did he just hire one guy? Probably not, because that's not very interesting. Whereas if he hires 3 guys and one of them's turned up dead, you can then say, oh, well, can they track down the other 2 guys before the mastermind gets to them? Maybe the second one dies, and maybe if the players are really stuck, because it's always a good idea to have something that can sort of G them along if they just get stuck and they know what to do. Maybe the third guy comes to them and he's like, oh, I don't want to get taken out like the other 2. Or if you protect me, I'll, like, give you some information.
Maybe the guy number 2 and 3 actually took out guy number 1 and the mastermind's really annoyed about it.
Yeah, there's a number of different ways you could spin it. And I think the only sort of issue in an investigative game is if you get to a point where the players are really stumped and they just sort of go, well, I don't know what to do. And you've got nothing to sort of spur that along with, because then the game just grinds to a halt and nothing sort of kills the interest in an investigation than just being like, I don't know what to do. What do we do? Whereas if you as a GM can always have it in the back pocket, something to spur on, like, I don't know, just as a silly sort of really obvious example, you don't have to be as obvious as this. Maybe goon number 2, maybe he's like, oh, these people are getting a bit close to, like, finding out what's going on. Maybe if I take that one of them out first, maybe the mastermind won't need to take me out. So maybe one of them panics, he makes a bit of an ill-advised attempt on one of the player characters. They can then, like, turn the tables, try and squeeze them for some information, and you can progress it along from there. And that, because you've got that sort of plan, it doesn't seem unduly forced.
I suppose it really comes back to that whole thing of know what your bad guys are likely to be up to. Put in a couple of points where things escalate and they're likely to interact with the player characters, and then depending on what the player characters do, react to that.
Yeah, very much so. And if we think back to when we were talking about the day 6 prompt motive, and we're talking about, like, various NPC motives and stuff like that, it's really a benefit to know why your bad guy, your mastermind, is doing what they're doing. Why do they want the idol? Because then you can have them behave in a consistent manner. If they're just like a mob thief who's like, oh, I'm going to steal this and I'm going to ransom it back to the museum for, like, untold riches, they might try and cut a deal with the PCs. They might be like, well, give us this money, you can have the idol back. And then you can have, maybe they can try and track down who left them the ransom note and all of that sort of stuff. Whereas if they're like, oh, I'm stealing it for, like, my dark god Imhotep and doing some, like, evil rituals, their reactions are going to be very different. But if you know what their motives are, you can at least, even when you're thinking on the fly, you can at least play them consistently. So as they do various things, the players will start working out what sort of person they're dealing with, even if they don't know who it is. So it's very different if you, like, get a group of thugs being like, oh, stay out of this if you know what's good for you, than if you're being attacked by, like, random, like, knife-wielding, like, religious fanatics in the streets. It's a very different vibe to the investigation, but the players will pick up on that. But in order to do that, you as a GM need to have a little bit of that sort of structure in place, even if you're just keeping it in your head.
Yep.
So that's it from me and Hannah for this RPGaDay 2025 episode.
Bye.
Hopefully you'll join us in the next one. And until we see you again, take care, stay safe, and whenever you're playing, have fun.